But I want to debate tonight not just the ethics of mandatory vaccines, but also just how efficient this vaccine really is. Because I don't think we've had enough of an open, honest debate in this country through our media channels on this. So joining me tonight are Norman Fenton, Director of Risk Information Management Research Group at Queen Mary University of London, and Sally Cutler, Professor of Medical Microbiology at the University of East London. Good evening and welcome to both of you.
Good evening.
Norman, I want to start with you. A few months ago, when the idea of vaccine passports first raised its head, we were told it would be unethical, un-English, un-British. It would never happen. And yet we have them now in Scotland and in Wales. And it's coming to England very, very shortly. So the unthinkable becomes the thinkable quite quickly in some situations. And now we're talking about mandatory vaccinations. I'd like to know your opinion, number one, on the morality and ethics of that. And number two, can you try and help answer my question? Are people who've been vaccinated much less likely to catch and pass the virus on to somebody else?
Well, first of all, even if the virus itself and the variants that are being spoken up as being highly dangerous, even if they're as deadly as being claimed, and even if the vaccines are as safe and effective as some people are claiming, I don't believe that anything like that justifies this gross intrusion of civil liberties and freedom of movement that something like mandatory vaccines impose. It actually contravenes the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which the UK is a signatory to. So, for example, Article 6 there says that any medical treatment requires free and informed consent. And Article 11 says there must be no discrimination or stigmatisation of people who refuse the treatment. And, of course, it also contravenes the Nuremberg Code. So irrespective of how dangerous it is, irrespective of how effective the vaccines are, this is a total erosion and infringement of our civil liberties and freedom of movement.
Okay.
And as far as the vaccine effectiveness is concerned...
Well, on the effectiveness, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
But one thing I do want to know is if I'm vaccinated and I'm standing next to somebody who's unvaccinated and we're visiting a care home of elderly people, am I, as the vaccinated person, much less likely to be carrying virus and to be a transmitter of it than the unvaccinated person?
Well, we just look at the statistics about the overall impact of the vaccine, of people who are vaccinated, and compare the unvaccinated with the vaccinated. And so far, the evidence from the UK government, from the United Kingdom Health and Safety Authority, what it seems to be showing is that actually there's no evidence that there are lower infection rates in the vaccinated compared with the unvaccinated.
OK. Norman, Sally, let's just begin with the moral point here. The idea that in Austria, in Germany, and who knows, maybe in this country, that we treat a section of the population, it might be 10 or 12% here, but it's 30% in Austria. The idea that we treat a large chunk of our population differently and that they have different rights depending on their vaccination status, how does that sit with you?
It's awkward, but basically they're trying to protect the population as best they can. And those people who are not vaccinated have less protection against infection. And so this is partly why they were doing this differential approach. But I think really sort of along the lines of your other speaker, I don't think that vaccination should be made compulsory. I think there is that freedom of choice and people should have that. That's what our ethics beliefs are founded on, that freedom of choice. And if people don't give that informed consent, I think really sort of that is taking things a step too far. But we are in a pandemic. We have to take sort of very radical decisions at this point in time. Not all of them are going to be permanent decisions, and many of these are short-term choices.
Sally, I get the point. I think we all agree that the imposition of mandatory vaccines would be a very retrograde step. But you make the point that the reason governments are getting tough is because the unvaccinated are more vulnerable. But actually, People decide to drink or smoke or take drugs or be grossly overweight or take no exercise, and they know these things are damaging their health chances. The real question to me is not whether somebody wants to take a bigger risk than the person next to them. It's this question that I keep asking and that nobody ever seems to be able to answer. And it's this: if I'm standing here as a vaccinated person next to an unvaccinated person going into that old people's home, am I any less likely to be a transmitter of the virus into that home because I've been vaccinated?
There's about a 50% reduction in your risk of becoming infected if you have actually been recently vaccinated. So that there is a reduction, but it's not total. You can still become infected. You can still pass that infection on. But there is a reduction, and there's also that protection from the more serious consequences. So you're less likely to be hospitalized. You're less likely
I get
to
that.
die.
No, listen, I understand that, and I believe that, and I'm not challenging that for one moment. But you say you think it's a 50% less chance?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to see some stats. I'd love to see some stats on that, Sally. I'd love to see some figures. But let's just move on to the further point. And the one that's worrying me. I've not questioned the vaccine at any point through this. I've taken it because, I thought the campaign that took place against the MMR vaccine was very counterproductive. The idea that, measles was back in London made me very nervous. So I, like tens of millions of others, was happy to be told, get the double vaccine, you'll be protected, the pandemic will be over. Now I'm being told I've got to have a booster, and no doubt another booster next summer, and one again at the end of next year, and perhaps a flu jab as well. And yet, and here's my problem, my concern, Sally. I look at Gibraltar, which has got a very, very high vaccination rate and yet has had a big COVID outbreak. I look at Israel, which has been very heavily vaccinated, but again, very high COVID outbreaks. And the question I'm asking is, if this vaccine does protect us from extreme illness and death, okay, but its level of protection from catching COVID again surely must now be called into question.
This is really sort of what the vaccine companies are actively working on. They do need to potentially modify the vaccine. We're at the beginning of this Omicron wave at the moment, and what we do know is that the level of mutation in this new variant means that the vaccine is not going to protect to the degree we'd like it to be protecting our population. And so it's very likely that we're going to need to tweak it. That will take time. The companies are suggesting sort of 100 days because it's not a massive change in the way that they're making the vaccine. It's just fine-tuning, as they do with the flu vaccine, on an annual basis. But it probably does need that modification.
Well, okay. Norman Fenton, I put the same point to you. I look at Gibraltar, I look at Israel, I look at, rates in this country, and it does seem that this vaccine doesn't give us very much protection from catching COVID at all.
Well, it doesn't. And also, there's also the issue about whether the very introduction of a mass vaccination program while there was a pandemic was itself potentially creating or leading to shedding and the creation of the new variants. That's something that also hasn't been very, very widely discussed. Certainly there's no evidence. We look at statistics, that's what we do. We look at public government statistics, and is there any real evidence of the efficacy of the vaccine? I actually dispute the ridiculously exaggerated claims about the idea that not only does the vaccine protect against infection, because it clearly doesn't seem to be from the data, the most vaccinated places seem to be the ones with the highest infection rates, but also about this whole idea that but it stops hospitalizations and deaths. Well, no, this is all based on very, very easily manipulated data. We all through the pandemic, there's incredibly manipulated data based on the definition of a case. That's just a positive. It's not an ill person. It's a person who's positive on a PCR test. And also this whole notion of what is a vaccinated person. So all of this data about hospitalizations and deaths, they define a vaccinated person as somebody who's at least, for example, at least 14 days after vaccination. Sometimes they have to be, double vaccinated to be counted.
Well, you're clearly, Norman.
Yeah, I mean, that's when most adverse reactions to the vaccine happen within the first 14 days.
You've clearly got a growing level of scepticism about this. Are the claims on the internet that Pfizer have put out a report talking about side effects from this vaccine being rather bigger than anybody has debated? Are these the hysterical wilder shores of the internet, or is it something we ought to be discussing?
We definitely should be discussing that. I mean, colleagues of mine, close colleagues, have looked very, very seriously at the adverse reaction data, and it is very, very concerning. We're seeing these...
But presumably, it's still a very small percentage.
It's a much bigger percentage compared with all previous vaccines. It's much, much higher. We've got these known cases of myocarditis, especially in young males, these strange cases of the footballers and other sportsmen sort of just dropping down, fainting, collapsing. But also our own data, looking at the Office for National Statistics' most recent data on mortality, overall, there's no significant difference on all-cause mortality between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, which also immediately suggests, well then, if the vaccine isn't, let's say, saving as many people as it's killing, then is it really worth it? But the thing is that the concern is about what happens to people at risk, people who are at risk, who were given the vaccine as a priority. What's the evidence about what happened to those people? That's something that needs to be very carefully looked at.
Look, statistics we can argue about all the time, but Sally, I've been bombarded. I'm sure you have, and all of us in any form of public debate in life. I've been bombarded for months with people talking about side effects of vaccines, and I've been very sceptical about the people that have written to me on the basis that I've generally been very, very pro-vaccines, and I still just about am. Do you have concerns, Sally, about that Pfizer report, about the sheer number of medical complaints that appear to be linked to the vaccine?
Really, I think the safety record is incredible with these vaccines. They're very, very impressive with their safety record. What I'd like to see is a little bit better on the efficacy. I would like to see that sterile immunity, that ability to prevent infection, not just the serious consequences, but the actual infection. And sadly, we haven't got that. And the safety record, I think really sort of the biggest issue that there was that very, very small number of people that had the blood clots. And they think now that they've got to the root cause of what was actually the problem there. And that's something that can be changed. And the vaccine will become even safer. So I would urge people that on safety grounds, there is no concern. The probability of an adverse reaction beyond a slight sore arm is minuscule.
Sally, I want to say to you, and Norman to you, to both of you, thank you for coming on, engaging in this debate. And you know something, folks, sitting at home, only on GB News will you actually hear both sides of this debate. And it's important that we do talk about these things and we do talk about people's concerns.